You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 3rd of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. Could Iran be the latest country to turn a blind eye to Washington's pressure? Is the UK ready to return to its place on the battlefield? And should you be fined for saying no to children in French restaurants? I'm Emma Nelson and the Monocle Daily starts now. Hello there and a very warm welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson and my guests Marian Messmer and Vincent McAviney will go through the day's biggest stories, including the Dutch are the latest country in Europe to lose its coalition government. So stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. So joining me around the table, Marian Messmer, Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House, and by Vincent McAviney, journalist, Monocle Radio, regular politics commentator, and both very warm welcome to you both, to Vinny and to you, Marian. How have your days been, or how have your last weeks been?
A day's been okay. My week is very strategic defense review heavy. So, just like thinking about the review and all of that good stuff.
I suppose when you see it coming over the horizon, what do? Do you sort of all sit down and like mark little things in your calendar, like no fun this week? It's all
pretty much, yeah. I mean, like we did a lot of pre-review strategizing, as colleagues, because we all hear various things. So we were like comparing notes. And then basically, from like 3 p.m. onwards yesterday, we were just like refreshing the browser window, waiting for, the Secretary of State to actually speak and then for the defense review to come out.
It's like getting tickets for Taylor Swift.
Pretty much. I was saying I should have asked one of my friends, who has access to a supercomputer to see whether they can get the PDF first. But
how fun. And then when it all comes out, do you sort of say, I was right about that thing about that?
Well, the nice thing is most of us were sort of part of the consultation period, right? So you definitely check whether your recommendations made it in.
Do you check whether you're in it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. And?
I am, yeah.
Which bit?
Well, there's something in there about integrated deterrence, like making sure that conventional and nuclear deterrence works better together and strengthening the UK's conventional deterrence capabilities, which I'm sure other people besides me have also said, but I definitely have said it and it's in there. So
I can barely understand what you've just said, let alone contribute anything intelligently to the strategic defence. Beat that, Vinny. Did you write the strategic defence review this week?
I am in a run of night shifts, so this week is all about strategic sleep in the daytimes. But I did take a trip last week to the Netherlands, actually, to Amsterdam, one of the countries we're going to be talking about on the programme, and it was a real delight. And it's really interesting, this whole approach they've taken to try and reset their tourism, trying to stop the stags and all the kind of wildness. There was less of that, but it's quite different from London. I mean, every museum we went to, very expensive, and the hotel tax, I'm not sure if this was the same pre-pandemic. Usually, if you go to France or wherever, it's a couple of euros and they often just want it in cash, but it's actually a percentage of your room rate. So it was 13%, I think, of the actual room rate, which we weren't told about in advance. So all of a sudden there was this extra bill on it. So it was, that was a little surprise.
And let's just go briefly back to the sleeping through the day, something which I think, I've had pretty good experience of. And the idea that I was in Helsinki a couple of weeks ago and the sun rises at 4 and set at the time at sort of around 10:30. And the amazing thing was that you go to work, or you go and see people at 9 o'clock the next morning and everybody was absolutely ragged because you'd say, how are you? And they just went, 4 o'clock. We're all up at 4 o'clock. And you'd think if the Finns can't do sleeping through the light, then what hope is there for us mere mortals who have, a pituitary gland which is slightly more regulated?
You've got to find a pattern. And for me, and having done it for a lot of years, there's signals that I give myself. So there's a particular drink I drink. There is a smell that I make sure I smell before I sleep. And then it's an eye mask and like the best curtains you can get for blackout. And then there is like a couple of steps in my mind that I take to go, I can sleep anywhere at any time these days. It is my new little superpower.
Wonderful. And I'm sure you'll be developing an app very soon for us all. Right, let's talk about what's going on in the world. And, let's talk about the man who vowed to be the Mr. Fix-It of the world's ills, the US President Donald Trump. He's probably finding it a bit harder to strike the deals needed to solve the most intractable of problems that he promised that he could fix. Yesterday, talks between Ukraine and Russia lasted a scant hour, Moscow seeming to opt to play things out as slowly slowly as possible. Well, now the next thorny issue on Donald Trump's plate is Iran and its nuclear enrichment program. 7 weeks since discussions resumed between Washington and Tehran, the red lines that neither side will cross are still in place and the threats are growing. Marion, let's begin with you. One of the things that Donald Trump has said is he's ruling out allowing Iran to enrich uranium in return once its sanctions lifted straight away. These are big issues that don't get sorted overnight.
Definitely. And I also suspect that the enrichment point is one that is very feasibly just going to break that negotiation, right? Because Iran has pursued nuclear energy for a really long time. And I mean, sure, Iran has enriched uranium far beyond the point that is required for fuel for nuclear power plants. But at the same time, Iran does have a legitimate right to use enriched uranium as nuclear fuel. And so I think the US pushing this very maximalist position when there previously were arrangements in place that made sure that the Iranian nuclear program was safe is just not necessarily going to be a recipe for success. And I can kind of understand why the Trump administration doesn't want to take the loss on that, because their whole reason for leaving the previous Iran deal was saying that a better deal was possible. So if they were to essentially go back to something that looked similar to the previous arrangement, then that would make them look quite weak. But at the same time, it's not clear to me that it is actually possible to get to an agreement without making concessions on this point.
Maximalist is the word that sort of seems to stitch through every initial approach by the Trump administration, whether you're bullying Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House, whether you're imposing increasingly extreme tariffs on people, and then there seems to be a wind down afterwards. Do we think we might see the same thing with Iran, Vinny?
Possibly. I mean, it's all about, as always, TV moments. And I read a really interesting piece recently where just when you think you've read everything you can about Donald Trump, you read something and it basically went through a load of his decisions when he was on The Apprentice. And more often than not, he would actually pick the weaker candidate who underperformed, but just to create TV moments. That is always the pattern in his head, create the reality TV moment. And when he got rid of the JCPOA back in his first term, it was purely a quote-unquote own the libs moment, jettisoning everything to do with Obama. And I don't think he really thought through, as much as I like to think he's the deal maker, how technical and how intricate that deal really was. And there isn't really a better deal out there. Otherwise, that highly skilled team that was in the Obama administration would have found it. And so he's stuck stalling on that one, hoping that people don't really remember it. Whereas to allies like Israel, it's obviously incredibly important. But he knows there is no easy win on that one and isn't prioritizing it. It's the same with Ukraine. It's the same with Russia. It's much more easy to stand up in Philadelphia on Friday and suddenly declare new tariffs on steel, once again, without saying to someone like Britain, oh, we're going to say this, but because we did that deal a month ago, don't worry, you're exempted. There is utter confusion in the steel markets now because he just is not details. It's all about the audience in front of him and those TV moments.
And anyone who's read the article by Joseph Nye that he wrote a couple of weeks before he died for us here at Monocle, he was going over the definition of soft power, which is something that at the end of his article, Nye said, Donald Trump does not understand, does not know soft power. Persuasion over coercion is not something that Donald Trump gets.
Makes sense. I mean, he's currently in the process of completely ruining the US higher education system, which is probably one of the biggest exporters of US soft power as well, right? So he seems to be someone who always needs to project power as sort of extremely as possible, and that in the end that just makes for actually quite a limited room for maneuver.
But if you are someone like, if you're looking at the Iranian regime, if you are Vladimir Putin sitting, waiting patiently in Moscow for it all to die down, is there a longer game to be played by those who have to deal with Donald Trump, which is after the maximalist, approach, you just sit and wait it out and he will dial it down and he will dial back?
There is, definitely. And well, there is a ticking clock that I think all governments and companies around the world are conscious of, is that you've got midterm elections next year. He will be heavily dependent once again on the support of Elon Musk and money from him. That is a little bit questionable at the moment, seeing as there is definitely a bit of a rift between the two. And then, according to the Constitution, he will be out in about 3.5 years' time. So if you're a company and there's all these talks of tariffs and he's telling you to build a factory and do all this, the runtime on building, designing, getting permission, building those factories, getting the equipment in, hiring all the people, you're talking a decade for the sort of complex manufacturing that he wants, like iPhones, like that sort of high-end processing chips. None of that is going to happen in his term. So a lot of companies are trying to sit back, figure out a game plan for the next couple of years, and then hope that the Democrats come in, or a more moderate Republican who tries to fix things because they will have gotten so much worse via Trump's economic policies, that it's better to just wait out. And I think a lot of governments, particularly the EU, are thinking that as well. China, these are organizations that don't work in sort of 4-year terms. They work in decades and beyond.
And how does that consolidate the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese position if they know that actually he's very noisy and very he's a big troublemaker, but at the end of the day, you might be able to just stick out the Ukraine war, or you might just be able to keep the nuclear deal at bay and keep enriching while everybody else is making noises. I mean, how does that change long-term strategies for adversarial nations to the US?
I mean, for Iran, I think they've been striking really difficult balance of continuing to enrich and sort of continuing to hedge whether they're actually going to develop nuclear capabilities or not. And I think it might get to a point where they almost sleepwalk into nuclear capability. And then, of course, you have the whole trouble in the Middle East that Israel has said at several points that they would rather go to preemptive strikes or go to war with Iran rather than letting Iran have nuclear weapons. If Iran was to successfully develop nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would probably be next. So you're looking at a pretty dangerous escalation or proliferation spiral in the Middle East. And that's the big risk that Trump is taking here and that we're seeing, I think. And I mean, for Russia, the situation is much easier in the sense that the war in Ukraine is costly for them, but not as costly as it was if Ukraine was to win or if there was an administration in the White House that was really supportive of Ukraine. So I think, unfortunately, the current situation is probably ideal for Russia and less ideal for anyone else.
And just on that nuclear point, it's really interesting. It's about the 15th anniversary of the formation of the coalition government here in the UK, which was between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. 15 years doesn't sound like much, but when you look back at the discussions, one of the main sticking points in that coalition agreement was that the Liberal Democrats wanted us to get rid of all of our nuclear weapons. They said that era has gone. We need to be a leader in denuclearization. We need to, we don't need these anymore. And yet we sit here now and we're looking at bringing in, not only replacing the kind of weapons we have, that constant at-sea deterrent, bringing in a new kind, bringing in the sort of tactical ones that are deployed from aircraft. And you just think that, the signal that sends is that nuclear weapons are only going to come, are going to spread further around the world, when it seemed like there was a trend where we were starting to get to the point of them edging back down.
Which is probably the moment when we should start bringing in your homework, Marion, because the UK Defence Review was published here yesterday. The UK, arguably a country which is trying to find its footing in the world once again. If we look at it from the outside, the UK seems to be quite a safe bet at the moment, doesn't it? Because for better or for worse, we have a stable government. It has long-term policies, and our relations with the external world seem to be improving compared with some of the more traditional players. We are reaching back out for a sort of a peaceful relationship with the European Union. We are being, we are the country which, or Sir Keir Starmer is one of the politicians who is is able to come up with a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine, but also have a conversation with Donald Trump without it going wrong. So here we are. We have the United Kingdom doing pretty well when it comes to soft power, but yesterday, there was that announcement that the United Kingdom needs to return to strengthening the military capabilities once again. Just as a bit of background, Marion, how bad had it got in terms of the way that the United Kingdom was going in terms of its defence? I mean, had we got to a point where we couldn't actually fight a full-scale war if needs be?
Well, I think the point is that the UK wasn't necessarily trying to fight a full-scale war, right? So one of the really big shifts in this review is that the UK government is acknowledging that it's moving from a time period in which it could essentially pick when it wanted to be at war, to a position where it might be forced to be at war by an external adversary such as Russia. And that's a very different posture. So previously, the UK tried to be agile. It tried to have a highly mobile force. It tried to have a force that was good at being deployed quickly and acting in crisis situations or acting in an environment such as the one that we were in Afghanistan or Iraq. Whereas what we're looking at now is a war that might look much more similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine, and also a war that wouldn't be a British choice. It would be something that might be instigated by Russia or potentially by a different adversary. And so I think that's really the big difference. And so a smaller, more agile fighting force isn't necessarily ready for this kind of big war that you would expect to see if it was really all of NATO at risk. And I think the other thing that the Strategic Defence Review handles very diplomatically, but was probably really on the minds of the reviewers, is that the position of the US and Europe has, of course, become much more in question. So there have been lots of mixed signals from the Trump administration over the last few months to what extent they would be moving away from Europe. They might be withdrawing troops at some point. There might be still some sort of surprise announcement at the NATO summit at the end of this month. So, and I think in terms of European NATO, that means that if we think about Russia as an actor that likes to take opportunities that present themselves, that's actually quite risky, because Russia already had this idea that NATO was primarily a US project. And if it looks like the US is no longer quite as committed to NATO, does that mean that Russia might misperceive there to be a weakness in European deterrence that probably actually doesn't exist, but could essentially embroil us in a long and devastating war similar to what we've seen in Ukraine? So I think that's really the big difference.
There is that expectation, isn't it, that, well, twofold, that firstly, the United Kingdom wouldn't ever have to fight a war by itself. There are alliances as well. But also that in order to receive that support, the United Kingdom has to chip in equally to make sure that it is, it can be part of the club. And NATO is trying to force the UK to increase its spending. Other members of alliances within Europe, I think Estonia was asked a couple of days ago, does the UK spend enough, contribute enough? And the answer was no, it doesn't.
So Keir Starmer's already said he's going to get to 2.5% by 2027. The Strategic Defence Review, I mean, we had this sort of convoluted narrative over the weekend from John Healey, the Defence Secretary, basically sort of saying, look, we're going to get to about 3% by sort of 2033-ish. That's the kind of lead time he's talking about. But that itself wasn't actually in the Defence Review. That was, if I get to all the things we're asking for in this review, that is where we will get to. It's really tricky with what's going to happen, because I think, it seems remarkable that, JD Vance came over to the Munich Security Conference and basically said, you guys are now in charge of Europe. We've got to look at Southeast Asia. But with Europe, we had clarity. We knew that America, under NATO articles, would step in if one of us were attacked, one attacked, all step in. But they're sort of pivoting to this, okay, well, we'll handle Southeast Asia. But then, there's sort of strategic ambiguity there that it's like, well, what will you do if China marches into Taiwan? That's not clear. Joe Biden kind of got close to saying, there might be some kind of reaction. But we've kind of made everything less stable by them sort of not being clear enough, I think, now in the South China Sea, and possibly pulling the rug out from Europe in terms of NATO. And there's no way, you're never going to not get Britain. This was seen as one of the big things that we could provide in a post-Brexit world, these negotiations. And we know that, Sir Keir Starmer folded slightly, if you want to call it that, on an absolutely tiny industry in the UK, which is fishing. But that was in order to get this big new EU defence fund. The UK is a massive manufacturer when it comes to military hardware. To be able to sell to our European neighbours is a great thing. And now we have what is being called the sort of, war dividend, which is there will be, under the funding, new munitions factories, there will be new technological investment, there will be more jobs around the UK because of this. And it then, as all military expenditure always does, it creates money for research and development and builds things that are then common in our day-to-day lives.
And where does we just mentioned there the building of, military equipment, the hardware that is used to fight a hot war. But Marion, when we start to look look at the other kind of conflict, the cybersecurity element of all this, where does the UK stand with this? Because I think a lot of us don't quite understand that. It's had it explained to me that the difference between a physical and a cyber attack is that imagine you have a shop and someone tries to burgle your shop. Once they can't get into your shop, they go somewhere else. Whereas in cyberspace, they will just keep trying to get into the shop for years and years and years and years and years until they get through. So that constant presence and that constant need to be ahead. Where does the UK stand with that?
The UK has already made quite a lot of investment in cybersecurity and cyber capabilities. So relatively speaking, it's not in a bad position. And this is also something that's going to be a huge future focus that the Strategic Defence Review talks quite a lot about. So I think we can essentially expect more from the UK on that. The UK also works really closely with Estonia, which is a huge leader when it comes to cyber capabilities within NATO. So there's a lot of potential for best practice exchange there and for more collaboration. So I think one of the things that the review was really strong on and that everyone will need to wrap their heads around is essentially that the cyber component of warfighting is going to be forever present now. We're never again going to see a war that's just kinetic. It's also always going to have a cyber component. It's always going to have a space component. There are just 5 domains of warfighting now, and you can't really just isolate to one of them.
Let's stay in Europe, but battles of a different kind. France, Germany, Portugal, and now in the last few hours, the Netherlands are 4 countries which have fallen into a political maelstrom after holding snap elections and then failing to govern through a coalition. Today, the Dutch government collapsed after the populist Geert Wilders withdrew his right-wing party from the ruling coalition, saying partners were stalling plans for the Netherlands' strictest migration policy ever. Vinny, another coalition bites the dust.
I mean, yeah, in a country where, they're much more sort of used to coalitions, this is another one that's collapsed. It was always a strange, it was a 4-party coalition, but then none of them actually wanted to be the prime minister. They got this sort of lifelong civil servant in to do that. So it didn't feel like it had a real longevity to it. But there is surprise in this. Although we're calling it a snap election with summer holidays and things, it sounds like it won't actually take place until October. So it will be a couple of months in which the country is slightly destabilised, as we mentioned, tries to host a NATO meeting at the end of this month.
And when you're trying to sort of cobble together a government, Marion, I mean, the snap election is often, the collapse of a coalition, I should say, is often the result of lots of quite extreme views trying to be pushed together to form something. And of course, the views are so extreme that this is just not going to work.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this attempt at a government as well is that lots of the parties didn't seem to compromise all that much with each other and seem to just continue to push their own agendas. So I guess, as Vincent said, maybe not a surprise that the government did collapse and look quite unstable from the start. But what I think is also quite interesting is if you look at polling right now, I mean, who knows what it will look like in October, but several of the parties that made it into government probably won't be re-elected. Like they're actually polling quite poorly, which I think also says quite a lot about, I don't know if it's fair to call them protest votes, but essentially when people feel driven to vote for parties that they might not actually support all that much, but they're just so fed up with the status quo that they go for something else. And then those parties can't actually govern very well or don't know how to act in government.
And then it goes back, perhaps, Vinny, to the thing you were talking about Donald Trump, that everything is a television show. So the short-termism and the need to make an impact either via social media or standing up and saying something outrageous and outlandish means that our patience with our politicians is shortening.
Yeah.
Indeed, politicians' patience with themselves is shortening.
Because it doesn't build more hospitals or fill the potholes. That's the problem, really, is that when it comes to delivery, extreme parties normally fail. And we've seen this time and again in the UK when the BNP, which was a far-right party, got in. They, had big gains in the sort of early 2010s. by one cycle later, they were all out, not only because they were terrible at trying to run things, but there was sort of rampant corruption and they all fell out with each other. Same again with UKIP. And we're probably, and I think this is why Labour probably are a bit relaxed about what's happening with reform, is that it's a long time in this country until a general election, 2029, and they think that there's enough time between now and then that a number of these reform councils will get into serious trouble because they'll prioritise the wrong thing, they'll try and be loud and brash, talk about policy areas that they've got no control over, like immigration, but actually don't do the day job. And that is something that we've sort of seen time and again. And the only thing I'd say with this, which is really interesting, is that when you think about Macron last year, normally sort of if you sort of collapse a coalition or you go for a snap election, as we saw with Rishi Sunak as well, it's the party that's called it that gets punished, or the one that triggers it that gets punished. But there's slightly enough runtime here, I mean, we're talking about in October, to try and sort of steadily build this kind of narrative that maybe means there's less kind of instant, frustration, I've got to go to the polls again and think we've got to go through an election again, that actually people have more time to think about what they want, even though Geert Wilders' party does seem to be struggling in the polls a little bit, and maybe that's why he pulled the plug.
And those extreme characters, the Geert Wilders and the Alternative for Deutschland and the Nigel Farages, one wonders whether there are enough checks and balances to ensure that whatever extreme views will be looked after by a coalition or a stable government. What people just simply need is a bit of stability.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big struggle. I mean, I was actually hoping that we would see the effect from, basically local government failure that then translates into national election a bit more in the last German election. But unfortunately, that didn't materialize quite as much as I had hoped. But I think it is a big problem when you get, sizable representation from these parties in national government, but they don't actually do their job, because it means that the constituents that are represented by these MPs don't get the proper service that they deserve, and it also heightens their platform in a way. And a lot of the time they are single issue parties, and they don't necessarily, that they kind of manufacture issues that don't necessarily require as much airtime as they get just by virtue of those parties being in power. So I'm not sure how we could tackle this better as a society, but it's something that I think requires a lot more attention given where Europe seems to be going as a whole.
I suspect it's going to be trial and error, as it usually is. It's 27 minutes past 6, 18:26 here in London, and you are listening to the Monocle Daily with me, Emma Nelson, joined around the table by Marion Mesmer, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, and Vincent McAviney, journalist, Monocle Radio regular. Finally, for this little bit of discussion, I think there's been some news breaking out of France, which suddenly sort of strikes chord to everybody who's ever stepped out of their house, because we have all been there, haven't we? We've been in a nice restaurant, a nice plane, a nice hotel, then explosions, screaming. Worse still, in my world, 47 scratchy rounds of the wheels on the bus blowing out from a tinny iPad speaker. Travelling with your own children, hands up, is for many quite enough. Arguably, though, a challenge of a different nature is trying to travel and enjoy yourself with other people's children around. Well, to try and deal with this or navigate its way through the niceties and the sensitivities of all this, France is contemplating fining hotels and restaurants for not allowing people to bring their children. Hands up who goes to a place hands up, obviously difficult on the radio, who goes to a restaurant or a thing where it is grown up enough that you actually aren't going to get kids there anyway. I'm going to raise my hand. Yeah. And we do that. And so why, I wonder, is France having such a problem with this? Because France, dare I say it, is really, really strict when it comes to the way that children behave in public. You have to be a tiny adult if you're going to participate in French, especially Parisian society, which isn't great when the person you're with is 3. But what are your thoughts on this, Vinny?
It's really interesting because there is a sort of behavioural thing. I think that it's a bad idea to sort of try and ban children from too many adult spaces. There are spaces that are certainly where it's maybe not appropriate for them to be, and if they are going to be there, then they need to be pretty well behaved. And you can see circumstances, there's an interview in The Guardian that's talking about this where, a woman who suffered several failed rounds of IVF, they would go away to adults only hotel because they just didn't want to be around people with children, or if you're a teacher and you spend your whole year with children, you might want to have some time off without them in the summer. But I think it's more about sort of standards and public behaviour. And I think in this country, I was on a train on Friday and it was really horrific because the parents got on with 2 children at the end of half-term week, but the parents immediately fell asleep and the kids were running around and playing loud music from Game Boys or whatever. It was just the worst sound ever. It is so grating. I think we need to collectively, and we talked about this, Andrew Muller and I have talked about this before, this whole thing on public transport of playing things from speaker, outright bans everywhere. Everyone is on board with this, and I don't know why we aren't on top of it. You didn't
step in and do a bit of Wheels on the Bus with the kids, Uncle Vinny?
No, absolutely not. I was working, so on the train. But this story does remind me of an amazing story about the origin story of Disneyland Paris is fascinating because any other government around the world would have been if you said to Britain now, and we saw this with Keir Starmer when Universal announced this massive new theme park, couldn't be more emphatic about it. They were, big presentations at the site looking when Disney said to France, that we want to build Disneyland, it was a collective shrug in the government, I guess, I don't know. This was a massive investment. Mitterrand didn't even go to the opening day. And there was a real attitude in France of why would people want to just do things for their children and take their children out? It's not about them. It's a really interesting cultural thing.
It's not cultural enough, arguably, for the French. But look, why is this such a problem in France? Because there are loads of places around the world where you can have children-free environments, and no one's caused up such a fuss that the government feels if it has to fine you for saying, actually, could you keep little Billy out of the way because he smashed all the crockery and, he's a bit noisy with his iPad.
I was really surprised at that as well, to be honest, because I think a lot of the time it's kind of self-regulating, right? I mean, if you have a fancier restaurant, then people might not necessarily bring their kids or something like that. But I guess France is pretty family friendly. They seem to have less issues with birth rates than other European countries. They have quite generous parental leave allocations, that sort of thing. So maybe for that reason, maybe it's an attempt to make sure that they remain a good place for raising kids. I don't really know.
I'm wondering whether actually children aren't the so great problem anymore, because most of them are obviously glued to a screen, and if you're lucky they have headphones on that stop you having to listen to what it is. The thing that I'm worrying now is that the world is becoming full of giant babies, adult babies who wander around in sort of tracksuits. And I sat next to a woman on a plane 2 weeks ago, and I was really, really looking forward to time on a plane, a nice grown-up space. And this woman came and sat next to me and was chewing the most astonishingly flavoured thing. And she had a massive sort of pile of pink pop that she just drank and burped her way through. And every time I tried to nip out, if I needed to go to the loo or whatever, she looked at me with such indignation that I had invaded her space, that it was can a grown-up try and behave like a grown-up? Because in certain cases, I'm finding children are behaving better than the adults. Vinny?
I mean, plain behaviour is a whole different category of chat on this. I'd say the one thing is, I do sometimes think it's quite sad when you see a family out for a meal and they've got sort of 2-3 kids, and they're of an age where they could probably hold a decent bit of conversation, and the kids are just on, the parents are sort of quietly talking and the kids have just got 3 iPads on the table and headphones on, and you do think sometimes that does kind of break the vibe of the restaurant. It's a place for people to gather, it's for conversations to be had, to sort of learn the ways of things, and I do think that sometimes that can be jarring. But I mean, it's interesting France has gone so extreme on this, because it, as I said, as we've been saying, it does sort of self-regulate, especially the times that adults solo tend to eat as well will be later, beyond children's bedtimes. But yeah, I suppose we're all about to have a summer of travelling across and around Europe on public transport and eating, and we'll see these kind of things flare up once again.
Fasten your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen. Marion and Vincent, thank you so much for joining us. Well, the Soviet Union and the Russia that succeeded it were never known for their encouragement of free expression. However, the most watchful secret police couldn't keep an eye on every public space at all times, leaving more or less limitless wall space on which the bolder dissidents could express themselves. Well, Alexis Lerner is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the US Naval Academy and spent many years collecting the satirical street art of the former Soviet sphere. Her work is gathered in a new book, Post-Soviet Graffiti, Free Speech in Authoritarian States. And earlier, Alexis spoke to Monocle's Andrew Muller. Let's have a listen.
So post-Soviet graffiti is, to me, it captures a particular moment in time, sort of the decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, including also, by the way, the late Soviet period. And also the residue of sort of that system. So the silence, the surveillance, the repression. Graffiti for me in that situation became a metaphor for how people can reclaim space, how they speak into silences, how they resist, often in subtle or subversive ways, as with graffiti. To me, the title brings together the place, the politics, the medium in a way that feels at the same time grounded and effective.
Part of your research was actually wandering the streets of Russian cities looking for this stuff. So when you decided to go looking for it, what did you go looking for? Because there's graffiti which is making some sort of statement, and there is graffiti which is just mindless scrawl, and there is graffiti which may look like mindless scrawl but is in fact something more than that.
This project is tremendously systematic. I'm a social scientist by profession. So when I went to each place, I would speak with individuals there. Often, by the way, I started sort of my snowball ethnography using couchsurfing.com. So I would go on couchsurfing. I would see who is interested, because you could note your interests in graffiti or street art. And then I would go and ask them, where should I find graffiti? Where should I find street art? If you were to segment your city of Minsk or Belarus, or Minsk in Belarus, or Budapest in Hungary, or Prague in the Czech Republic, how would you segment it? Where is the artist area? Where is the student area? Where is a downtown area? Are there any sanctioned walls where artists can freely paint without concern about repression or reaction? And then I would go there and I would meet with them. I would ask them if they wanted to meet. And again, the snowball method, after a day together, they would introduce me to somebody else and so on and so forth. And so I wasn't necessarily just walking the streets aimlessly. In fact, I was going to certain areas, the artist district, the downtown district, the tourist area, the student area, and so on. And I was looking at what kind of graffiti was in those specific locations. I would ask many people, so I could kind of cross-validate their answers. And also, by the way, when they were recommending me to other artists, I was kind of moving up the hierarchy of that social realm so that I was meeting with higher and higher sort of socially ranked artists over time. And I wasn't just going to Russia. I was going to St. Petersburg and Moscow and Vladivostok, but also beyond Russia to Belarus and Hungary, Czech Republic, all over the Baltics, Georgia, Ukraine, and so on.
When you spoke to the artists, though, did they have, I guess, overlapping concerns? Were they principally animated by an anti-authority bent?
Some were not. Many were. Many were. And to me, as a political scientist, those are the ones that were the most interesting to hear their perspective, but some were not. Some were in it for community, kind of for ego. When I interviewed someone here in the US, I asked them, why do you paint? And he said, of course, for ego. That's why artists paint in the US, primarily. At least this was 10 years ago. And that felt quintessentially different to me in the post-Soviet and post-communist European regions, that there they were painting because they didn't have access to the mainstream media, to the newspaper or the television where they could express themselves. Instead, they were using this as almost as a last resort of communication.
Did you encounter any instances of it actually, and I'm thinking here especially of the anti-authority graffiti, of it actually making a difference, even as much as making authorities uncomfortable and nervous? I'm thinking of my own experience reporting from Serbia in the dying twilight of the Milosevic regime, when Belgrade was covered in graffiti left there by Otpor, the student movement, which consisted mostly of just the Serbian phrase for "he's finished," and their idea was that this would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which it eventually did.
Oh, absolutely. There was a tremendous amount of anti-regime graffiti, predominantly in your more consolidated authoritarian states, again, like Russia, Belarus, Hungary even, which is not necessarily consolidated authoritarian, but you would see it there. A lot of anti-Orban, anti-Putin, anti-Lukashenko graffiti, where we assume that not only is graffiti effective as an accessible and anonymous tool of communicating, but that the autocrats know this. We know this because they are co-opting the artists, the art form, the spaces in which that art previously was subversive in order to promote a pro-regime narrative. So we know that they see that graffiti matters. there's still space for regime critics to create art in these cities. However, we do see that it's in some cases, predominantly in Moscow, being pushed sort of to the outskirts of town, being flooded out of the downtown public spaces.
Just as a final thought, the book is illustrated with lots of pictures of the artworks you're talking about, and it's a bit of a local radio host's question, but I'm curious anyway. Do you have a particular favourite? Is there one from all your travels that really strikes you as especially, witty or perceptive, or all of the above?
I love so many of the graffiti and street art images that I've seen over the course of the decade when I was collecting the fieldwork for this book. But some of my favorites are around the 2012 election in Moscow. That was just a phenomenally poignant time for political graffiti in the post-Soviet region. And some that I particularly love are behind me, actually, on this wall. Perhaps you can't do that on the radio, but I have this one behind me, which is I took with a 35 millimeter camera, and it says, "I love free speech. I love independent courts." And to me, it was in an artist area, and there's a woman looking out the window smoking a cigarette, and it's freezing. There's snow everywhere. It's the middle of March. To me, it indicates something specifically about the nature of censorship in authoritarian states, that because there is such censorship and because there aren't independent courts, this is why these artists are painting about these things on the walls of their city. Why would you paint, "I love free speech, I love independent courts," unless that was something that was potentially threatened?
And that was Alexis Lerner in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Muller. That's all the time we have for today's edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panellists, Vincent McAviney and Marion Mesmer. Today's show is produced by Carlotta Rubella and researched by Francesca Gilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. For now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.